Let's see.
All right.
Is
Well,
that?
welcome to the. Oh, sorry. I'll fix that later.
Go for it.
Yeah. Hey, well, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have. I've been watching your work for a little while here and really excited to have you on and have this conversation. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell the listeners what it is that you do and what kind of work you're passionate about.
Sure. Thank you. Furkan, right? Is that the correct way of pronouncing your name? Excellent, because I haven't gotten the chance to say it. We've talked before, but I haven't gotten the chance to say your name before. So thanks for having me on. My name is Will Spencer. I host the Renaissance of Men podcast, which has been going for a couple years now, just coming up on my 100th episode, which is very exciting. And what I say is I host extended conversations about the rebirth of masculinity, rebirth of virtuous masculinity happening around the world today. So in those conversations, we'll talk about this worldwide movement that seems to be growing and that I say has actually been going for about 40 years. Like I didn't start the Renaissance of Men. It's a thing that I observed and that I gave it a name. So we talk about issues related to that on the podcast. I also have a men's mentorship program, a 12-week mentorship program that I'm very, very happy with and very proud of. That's affected many men's lives positively. And I also host men's groups and stir up trouble on Twitter and Instagram pretty regularly.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for sharing all that. And I have noticed that you do like to jump right into things. So why don't we do that here as well?
Right on.
Um, like from the get go, based on everything you've seen and what you've observed, what is currently wrong or not? I wouldn't say wrong, but the issue with masculinity we're seeing and why are we going through this renaissance?
Oh, that is a massive question with a lot of moving pieces to it. So I guess it depends on what level you want to look at it. So we can look at it at the level of, say, individual men and say what's going on with individual men. We can look at it at the level. I'll just pick one, or you can pick one, and we'll dive into it. We can look at it at the level of society today. We can
Yeah.
look at it at the level of history and culture and politics. And so it just depends on what level of resolution that you want to look at it. And
Yeah.
and so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think on an individual level, I think obviously to your point, culture and society often dictates what men or how men should be. But I think if at an individual level, if you have a good handle on your own masculinity, you can kind of pick and choose and carve your own path. So maybe starting there on an individual level.
Yeah, so I think on an individual level, it's that men as a whole are broken in half. So on one half of the equation, you have what we might call sort of macho guys that are really strong and confident in the world, and they're able to take really directed action, but they don't have a lot of emotional or spiritual depth, right? And they suppress their feelings. They don't know how to work with their feelings. They don't think their feelings have value, kind of like no one cares, work harder. You know what I mean? Like to the point where you burn yourself out, whether in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and you realize there's more to life than what I can achieve materially.
Right.
That's one side of masculinity that's missing something. On the other side of masculinity is our passive men who have a lot of emotional depth and sometimes even spiritual depth, but they lack the ability to take directed action forward in their lives. They lack fire and they lack passion. And
Right.
so it's what we're looking at is we're looking at one complete man who's been broken in half, because a truly integrated man and virtuous man fuses those two halves together. He's able to have emotional and spiritual depth, but also to be very rational and to take directed action and move back and forth between those two ways of being. And so, any man listening to this may find himself on one end of that spectrum or the other.
Mhm.
And so that is what I think that's what that. And there's a lot of reasons how we got here. Men weren't always this way. This has been an active process to shatter men, to break them in half, to make them this way. That we're both at the tail end of and the leading edge of the wave to remedy that. But just for right now, that shattering process is what leads to a lot of negative ideas about men, particularly from women, because they go back and forth between, like, for example, like the alpha and the beta. You know what I mean? Like, then there's a lot of red pill discussion about that. That's actually not two different kinds of men. That's one man who's been broken in half. And so
Right.
if you look across society, you'll see that often,
Yeah.
possibly every
Yeah.
day.
For sure. And I think the former resonates for me. Like, for the
Mm.
longest part of my life, I was just on this mission to achieve, achieve, achieve. And then at one point I realized that, well, there is more to life here. I have to be a father now, and I have to think about what kind of world and life I want to create for my son, and how am I going to show up. And those achievements will only get me so far. And quite often men do realize it, or they realize it and it's too late.
Yeah.
And that could be a problem too. Now, you did touch on the idea of labels, right? The alpha and the beta,
Yeah.
and you hear toxic masculinity and all of that. Like, what are your
Hmm.
thoughts about these labels being thrown around? And I'll kind of explain where I'm going with this, because I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of the times these labels are thrown at men to often confuse them as well, because then they start questioning themselves in how they're showing up. And so there's an aspect of confusion, but I also want to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation. So let's start with, I'll do toxic masculinity real quick.
Yeah.
So what the way that toxic masculinity is used is to describe those very strong physically and intellectually, very strong physically and intellectually men, mentally, I guess you might say, when they start doing something that a woman doesn't like. That's called toxic masculinity. And let's just grant the point and say that the man is behaving out of pocket, right? That
Yeah.
he is being brutish or bullying or whatever. Okay, that's one kind of toxic masculinity that that takes up all the air and space in a room. That's one kind of toxic masculinity. What I say is there's actually another side of toxic masculinity, which is the weak and passive man who drains all the vitality from the room because he doesn't give of himself out of fear or hesitation. So there's actually two kinds of toxic masculinity that we're dealing with, and that's sort of an invisible problem. So that creates a greater picture of true masculinity is through the middle of those two extremes, right? And it provides a way to orient ourselves. So that's part one. So about alpha and beta. Now, those terms were useful to a point, but they've been taken way too far. Because first of all, to call a man alpha, like, there's no situation where a man is alpha in all scenarios. You could be completely quote unquote alpha at the office and be beta on the basketball court with your bros, not be the best player, but you could be the best salesman or whatever, right? So it's like situational. But even then, there's a level of resolution that, like, look, not every man wants to be William Wallace. It's enough for some men to follow a William Wallace, and there's nothing lesser about that position. In fact, if you watch that movie, and there's many examples of this, obviously I'll just pick this film, you see William Wallace is the leader of so many capable men. They're all very capable. Now, strictly speaking, you'd call them a beta, but there's
Right.
nothing beta about any of those men. So these terms are, not only are they so completely misapplied, laden with judgments and shame, right? But they're also kind of irrelevant, because, like, any one of those dudes from Braveheart, though he's a beta compared to William Wallace, is still plenty alpha. So what do you call them?
Right.
Right. And so this is where the red pill, kind of manosphere ideology was useful for a while, and has kind of, in my opinion, reached its expiration date.
Right. Right. And
That's some of the
there's a
trouble I
lot.
stir up about that.
No, there's a lot to unpack here. So, to your point, even if you think about it, in that scenario with William Wallace, if he thought those men were betas, I don't think he would trust them with his own well-being, right? Like,
Right. Right.
clearly he has enough trust, and I think a lot of men get caught up in this, well, I want to be the alpha in the room, and don't want to give up that leadership to another man, because they're thinking that, oh, I'm going to be thought of less than. But it's like being on a team, right? Not everyone can
Yes.
be the captain. You're all having a role to fulfill, and without you, the team won't succeed. And that's how people need to start thinking about it. And I think, again, with this messaging men receive, they get caught up in that and lose focus. And I think a lot of the
Hmm.
times it impacts their relationships with other men. I see it a lot where you don't see a lot of men having close, tight knit friendships or
Yeah.
brotherhoods for that reason, because there's that constant competitiveness or envy happening in those relationships.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if there's always a concern, if some guy, and I really hope that there aren't guys that are actually like this, that are, have the "Am I being alpha enough" script running in their head all the time. Like, how is that dude ever going to form friendships? Because either he's got to make sure that he's alpha over all the beta friends that are around him, or he's always got to challenge the guy who's the alpha next to him for dominance. Like, what a great way to keep men divided if they're stuck in this binary prison. Like, is it enough for you to lead in the environments that you excel at and follow in the environments that you don't? And can you be comfortable in that position? And I'm going to guess that most men actually can, because they are. Like, you can, and I think, to add an even greater level of resolution to this, yes, you should lead your home. That's a place where, and we can talk about this, unquestioned, you should be leading your home. But is that like, I'm alpha in my home? Like, come on, bro. Like, you don't need to think about it that way.
Right.
So this idea of understanding, the qualities that make a man dominant, I think, is important, because I think men need to have some grasp or understanding of what that is, so that they can embody it in their home and in the environments that they're called to lead in. But if you're always looking at every other man and you're comparing whether you're the alpha or not, that's literally an imprisoned existence. And I feel for guys who get trapped that way, because you mentioned, we started out talking about what's wrong with men. So many men are underfathered. They're the children of single mothers, right? Or they had absent or abusive or distant fathers. And so they look to so many men, content creators, as a source of authority and father energy. And they have this hole that's waiting to receive a father's love, and that never got it. And so the first thing that they see, anything that feels like masculinity, they just plug it into that, and they become, this is how they fall into cults of personality, really. And there's a lot of that. And it's just a
Absolutely.
response to this father need, that, I mean, it's good as far as it goes, but when men get stuck in there, and many have, it's a real tragedy to see. But I do think that phase is kind of coming to an end, hopefully, and but
Yeah.
also slowly.
Right, right. And to your point, I think research has shown a lot of those men who lack those connections, whether it's with a father figure or whatever for that matter, those are the guys who typically gravitate towards gangs and cults and
Yes.
all kinds of movements like that. And all they're really seeking is that connection. And when they find it, that's what they're really gravitating towards, is that connection and having that relationship.
Yes, yes, they're looking for a father, they're looking for a community, they're looking for a sense of effectiveness in the world, right? And they're looking for someone that they regard as a champion,
Right.
and it's very natural, but it's only in this, I guess, father vacuum. Like, what I say is that the what we are suffering from is a society wide father hunger. But the men's movement, really, up until this point, at least for the past 10 years anyway, has tried to solve the problem with a bunch of older brothers.
Right.
An older brother cannot solve father hunger,
Yeah,
cannot solve the problem. So we
absolutely.
actually need men that are elders to come back and begin offering that energy, which means we have to get past our cult of youth, and that's a whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I do want to come back to that father figure piece, because I think there's something more deeper there, that men need to tap into. But I do want to first touch on, the fact that you mentioned the whole red pill movement, and not a lot of people have a good grasp of it. So do you mind kind of explaining that, if you don't mind, and
Yeah.
sharing why that's become a problem and why it was perhaps effective at one point?
Yeah. So the red pill grew out of the pickup era. So a bunch of men in Los Angeles in the late '90s, early 2000s, discovered a series of conversational techniques, essentially called game, which was really successful in getting girls, potentially, maybe low value girls, maybe fast girls, whatever, into one night stands because it's a game. And to win the game, you get the girl into bed. And then
Yep.
what do? Nothing, because these men lacked any ability to form long-term relationships or even have friendships. But
Right.
out of that, but these men in the pickup era were filing on websites, message boards, forums, stuff, these things called field reports, where they would lay out, this is what I did and this is how, where they kind of
Yep.
documented the entire encounter. Out of that body of data, the guys who were on the forums began realizing that there were certain patterns. And the
Hmm.
major pattern that they realized is that, it was a couple things, was that what they were told was attractive to women, be sweet, be nice, be loving, be kind, was not what women actually wanted. What they
Hmm.
wanted was men who were dominant and confident and aggressive. Even if the guys were losers behind the scenes, if they could fake being dominant
Right.
and confident and aggressive, they could get laid. Okay,
Yeah.
so that was a big light going off. It was like, wait a minute, maybe things don't work the way that we've been told,
Right.
right? And so out of that came this idea that is actually pretty fundamental, pretty basic, which is that men and women are different. And what makes a woman high value in what they call the sexual marketplace is not what makes a man high value in the sexual marketplace. Women are prized for their youth and for their beauty. That's what makes a woman desirable. A man is prized less so for his physical attractiveness and more for his physical dominance and ability to provide. And
Right.
so, what makes a man and women attractive are different, and they happen at different times in life. So, a woman's peak sexual market value is in her early 20s, right? A man's peak sexual market value is somewhere between his late 30s and early 40s, right? Something
Right.
like, or mid
And
40s, right?
and that's a biological thing too, right? That's
That is a biological thing.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing: the red pill, as a from the Matrix, doesn't teach you something that isn't already there. It just helps you see what's already there. That's the power of the metaphor, right? So what the red pill did was just strip away decades of feminist programming that says men and women are the same, they want the same things, and they're functionally equal. And the men, like, no, this is not the case. Women
Right.
are desirable for this reason. Men are desirable for this reason. Oh my gosh! So that's the red pills, that men wake up to these realities of the sexual marketplace. Now, there's no more aspects of this. Now, you asked, why is the red pill controversial? The red pill is controversial because what they were essentially discovering is biblical truth, God's created design, which these men then exploited to do these things called spinning plates. Like, you just see a bunch of girls and you just run game on them, and because you're the high value man, and if you don't have any reason to have kids or start a family, just spin plates and sleep with women forever because you're a high value man
Right.
and you can dictate terms, right? It's ultimately very godless and materialistic. And so that's why the red pill is controversial, not just because it offends feminism, but because what the men did with that knowledge was essentially like promiscuity and fornication, and you know and now
Right.
here we are.
Yeah,
Yay.
and to build on that, I think a lot of that was glorified too, right? I remember
Yeah.
even like when I was in my 20s, it was like guys were bragging about how many girls they were sleeping with, and then it
Yeah.
was like whoa, and then it was like a competition, and then the guy who was sleeping with the most women was glorified, and I think that also became more detrimental because a lot of guys who necessarily wouldn't have gone down that path started doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the sad part about it is that it's all just traced back to the same kind of father hunger. Like, why are men going to the nightclubs to get validation from women through sex? Why are they not competing with each other as brothers in tribes, or groups of friends, competing in that way, right? And showing their prowess that way and attracting a good woman. Instead, they're going out and running game, and God knows the wreckage that was created by that. I can't even speculate about it, but there's a lot of it, and it was very much celebrated. And a really good example of that is this man named Roosh V. He was one of the most notorious pickup artists in the world. He would fly around the world and he would release all these guides for how to get laid in all these cities around the world. And he was quite successful at it. He has since repented and become Eastern Orthodox Christian, very devout. And he pulled all of his books from Amazon. I think he burned the remainders and no longer gets any money, from anything that he created. And he's repented fully. And he talks about how empty and dead that life was for him, despite all the money he was making. Right. And I think that's an incrimination of all the men who practice that lifestyle.
Right, absolutely. And that kind of leads us to that whole concept then, like, why are men struggling with that whole absence of that father figure? And to me, I think part of it has to do with not believing in something bigger than themselves, not having that greater power or purpose in their life. That's what I feel. But
Yeah.
I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, this is a hugely complicated question that involves culture and politics and history. So, on a root level, like, yes, it is ultimately, the modern destruction of God the Father. Just any notion of there being, that of a Father God. That at the highest level of ultimate reality,
Exactly.
the supreme being reveals himself as Father. That was taken out of American culture, world culture, progressively over the past 250 years.
Yeah.
But why are we lacking human fathers? And that's been a multi step process that I think has gone back to the Industrial Revolution. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, I'll run through it really quickly.
Yeah.
At the
Yeah.
beginning of in the Industrial Revolution, men who used to work on homesteads and farms and as what we might call small business owners with their families were taken out of those environments and forced to work in factories. They were taken out of the home, right? So that breaks the father-son bond. And then you have World War One. 10 million soldiers died around the world. Then you have the Great Depression, and then you have World War II. 25 million soldiers died, right? And so then you go swinging into the 50s and the 60s. In the 50s, all the groundwork for the sexual revolution was laid,
Yeah.
no pun intended, with Playboy and Kinsey and all of that. It just seeded the ground so that in the 1960s, you interject the hippies and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and this explosion of sexual energy just because, bursts out
Right.
all over the world, sexual liberation and the pill. So now sex is consequence free, right? So women can have sex. So now you have this huge supply of sex and sexuality, and all the fathers that would have prevented that are dead on the beaches of Normandy or in Europe or whatever. And there's no fathers to hold that back. And
Right.
so then you have the baby boomer generation that spends the 60s and the 70s indulging in pleasure. And then they have kids like in the 70s and the 80s. And then before we have a chance to really regroup and bring fathers back in, you have the mass media just slamming into culture all throughout the 80s. You have Rambo and you have like all those 80s hair bands and Greed is Good distorting everyone's minds through
Right.
culture. And then in the 90s, 2000s and 2010s, you have the progressive dismantling of the presence of fatherhood in politics, and then further into culture where you start getting into transgenderism and stuff like that. Now, every step of that way feeds into the next one. It's a very well executed
Right.
plan, and
Yeah.
it's almost successful. Too bad, suckers. Because men are coming back because there is a
Yeah.
renaissance of men, which is
Right.
everything that I talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel like a lot of that programming, to your point, it has been very deliberately and carefully planned? Do you feel like a lot of it's still happening? And I'm referring to dating apps as well, and a lot of the issues that farmers are facing too across the world. Same thing to your point, like the fathers are being removed from the homes. Do you feel like that's still happening? And I could obviously see your point that the men are coming back, but there's still a long ways to go and an uphill battle here, right?
Yes, but this plan has been in motion. Since essentially the French Revolution. Which is like the 1700s, so 250 years.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing, and because I can go further back the Industrial Revolution, but we'll just we'll leave the history lesson behind. So the thing is that we are on the leading edge of this war on masculinity. But a man can turn his life around 180 degrees in 6 months to a year. It's amazing. It's
Yep.
amazing. You can take the most passive, insecure, and weak guy, and you take him into the gym and you give him a barbell and you shepherd him and mentor him through that experience and get him started within a year, especially if he's younger, like if he's in his young 20s, within a year, he can be a completely different guy. All that plan gone in an instant. How much money can you make online, in 2 years with dedication, if you really put your mind to it and create, especially if you go in weak and then you document your fitness journey over the course of a year to start a YouTube channel. I mean, like all of these things, they seem very dire, and they are, because all the levers of the institutions of power are now, which humanity built to serve us. We built the institutions of law, science, medicine, government to serve humanity. And all those institutions, through the long march of the institutions, have now been co-opted and are now using to prey on people, to tyrannize them. And that's really happening, and that's a real thing, right?
Right.
But ultimately, the institutions are powerless over your ability to recreate yourself, and they're powerless in the face of an embodied man. And especially, and this is the thing about the Renaissance of Men that I like the most, is that it's not led by one guy. The
Hmm.
Renaissance of Men is not about me, right? It is about thousands, millions of men all over the world being reborn, redeeming masculinity. And you can't stop all of us, right? It's not about one guy. It's not about Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan. All those guys are part of it, in the same way that the Italian Renaissance in the 1500s was not just about Michelangelo, and not just about Da Vinci, and not just about Brunelleschi and all the Titian and all these artists. It was all these men pursuing beauty and excellence completely independently from each other, inspiring each other forward. That's why I call this the Renaissance of Men, is that it's not about one guy. It's about all of us, and we cannot all be stopped.
Right. Yeah. No. And that's powerful. I agree with you 100%. And that's the thing as well, right? We can't lose focus of what's in our control,
Yes.
and what we can do on an individual level, and not worrying about what everyone else is doing. If we can focus on ourselves, there's so much power, and there's so much we can do individually.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the amount of things that are within our control on a daily basis. Like when you turn off social media, like I use an app called Freedom.to, and I think that's the URL. And what it does is it blocks social media, all of it on my phone, for as long as I wanted to, all day if I wanted. On my
Yeah.
Mac, I use a program called Self Control. It blocks everything. You can't even remove these blocks. You can't uninstall the application. They're just there. And when I turn off social media, it's like, oh, wow, look, there's like birds on the trees and there's sunshine outside and like all the crazy stuff that's happening. Like, I don't know. I think I'm going to write something cool today and make myself, some steak and eggs, and I'm going to work out, and I'm going to be at peace and control the things in my life that are that are within my control. Because I think social media has the effect, if this may have been its intention, but it definitely has the effect to flood our psyches full of things that seem to demand our ability to control, but we can't control. And it gives this feeling of dread, like, I can't control this, I can't control this, I can't control this. It's like, and it distracts us from the things in our lives that we can control.
Right, right. And it's to flood us with like the information, right? The algorithms are built that way to continuously keep us in that loop.
Yep.
So yeah, I
Yep.
agree with you. So to kind of take a different direction, and we chatted about this previously, but wanted to get your take on this whole idea of people talking about embracing our femininity as men. And
No.
explain,
Sorry.
please.
Sorry. I didn't mean to let you. I'll let you
No, no,
finish the
no, no.
question.
That's it. I just wanted you to build on that.
Right. Okay. So I spent a lot of time in the inner healing world, where this idea is a thing that men need to embrace their feminine side. And to that, I say, as you heard me say, I say, no, we're men. We don't have a feminine side. And there's two reasons that I say that. First, the feminine side, quote unquote, is usually meant to describe emotions, feelings, intuitions. Okay. Why is it that those are inherently feminine? And if those are inherently feminine, like, do women have to get in touch? Do women get to own? Do men get to own the strength that women have, or is that a feminine strength? right? Right. So this idea that things get kind of blended, that, oh, my feelings are my feminine side, what it actually does is it gives every bit of feeling over to the feminine side. It says men have no feeling. Now that's not true, because you can look all the way back through history, and I do a series called Poetry for Men on my podcast, where I read and interpret a poem. I read and analyze a poem. And through doing that, I've learned, and you can do this through whatever your favorite art form is, whether it be music or theater or sculpture, whatever, poetry, song. Men feel very deeply, and if you had told these impassioned poets, like, oh, you're just getting in touch with your feminine side, they would say, no, I feel as a man, I emote as a man, I relate to my feelings like a man, because men and women relate to their feelings differently. Women, their feelings are the primary way in which they meet reality. That's why we
Right.
love them, that they're
Yeah.
in touch with a deeper source. For men, our feelings have to be buttoned up at a moment's notice. You can be having, as a man, the most intense feeling experience ever at a romantic dinner at a restaurant, with your girlfriend.
Right.
And the second someone says, everybody be cool, this is a robbery, your feelings go away in an instant and you're on. Women do not relate to their feelings that way. I don't think that they can. Men have to. It doesn't matter. And so, just at the very base level, the way that we relate to our feelings is different. The way that our feelings as men inform our approach to reality, but don't guide it, is different. And so, this is why I say that, like, this is not our feminine side. This is masculine emotions. This is masculine feeling as a man, and it doesn't belong. It doesn't belong to women. Women have their own strength. Women have their own feelings. Men have our strength. Men have our feelings, and we meet in the middle gloriously, rather than just like exchanging pieces of
Right.
ourselves.
Right. And you need both, right? It's the yin and yang to balance each other out. And to your
Yeah.
point, from a decision making perspective, you can't always have emotions involved when you're looking to make a decision. You almost have to approach it from a rational and logical perspective.
Yeah. I think your emotions should get a seat at the table. I think they have to, because there are it, based on the situation, where, as a man, where your emotions, the seat at the table that your emotions get changes, right? Some situations, your emotions has got to have a real small seat at the table. Some situations, the emotion maybe gets a bigger seat. But for a man, emotions never get a seat at the head of the table.
Right.
You should, like, I'm going to make this decision with my emotions. Like, is it like, I think any man who's probably followed through on that probably ended up regretting that decision,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it's
But
like
then,
the perfect example is when you make a decision when you're angry, right? And you look back and
oh,
you're like, oh, that was the worst
yeah.
decision I made, right?
Yes, yes, and when you make a decision when you're, quote, in love, right? And so, this is one of the things that I've been talking about lately, is that I think we all know how important it is to choose a good partner as men right now. And one of the things that sex does is it blinds us to the other person for a good 3 months,
Right.
right? We lose the ability to critically evaluate the other person, and we get 3 months into it, and then we have a big fight, and maybe we make it through the fight, and maybe we don't. But and maybe a breakup happens, and then we're in agony for weeks or months, right? And it's this whole cycle, because we've gotten our hormones and our emotions all mixed up and lost the ability to see, is this woman actually good for me? Is she going to aid me on my journey? Does she want the same things, or do we
Right.
just have good kicks together?
Yeah.
And many men get caught. I've been caught in that, you know what I mean, many
Yeah.
times,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Which
I
is why
think
I speak out against it.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the same applies to women, right? And in fact,
Yeah.
the release of oxytocin is a lot more profound in women after sex. So a lot of the times you
Yeah.
have to again be mindful of why are you being with this person. So that's an
Yeah.
important distinction. Um, yeah. So the other piece I wanted to touch on, and you mentioned briefly that a lot of transformation can happen within 6 to 18 months for a man, especially going to a gym.
Yeah.
And I can see
It
truth to
starts
that.
there.
Yeah, it starts there. I think the biggest piece, and I'm speaking out of personal experience, not only for myself but other men I've seen or worked with. A lot of it is on a deeper level from a spiritual side. And I know you touched on that briefly too. What are your thoughts on that? And again, we've talked about it on and off a little bit, but I think part of the problem I see is that lack of spirituality or having that connection within yourself and to a larger extent with a community.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're as a man, your theology, which every man has, whether he admits it or not, whether he's aware of it or not, your theology has a profound influence on your life, if only subconsciously. So, what are the options available for men to worship right now? So, if you're an atheist, you probably worship science. Like I get all my answers from science, one way or another. If you're in the New Age world, uh, the god of the New Age world is essentially a woman, and
Yeah.
I spent many years in the New Age world, and I can prove that. I won't do that right now, but I can absolutely prove that. So you're worshiping science, right? Or you're worshiping a woman,
Yep.
right? And or if you're like in the Buddhist world, you don't really worship anything, but your highest goal is to negate yourself and not exist anymore. Like I don't think that that's a way to live. Like, well, ultimately, I want to be done with living. It's like that's no way to deeply engage with life. And I've done Buddhist meditation retreats in Kashmir, so like I know what I'm talking about here. That is what part of my story is world travel and exploring many different world faiths, including Hinduism and Buddhism and you know tribal religions in South America. So I know what I'm talking about here. Now, the thing is, if you want to become a masculine man, you have to worship a masculine God, because you can't become a masculine man worshiping science, because science can't actually tell you how to be a man, because science is just evolution, and evolution changes. And what if we're all evolving into transgender androids right now, right? Like that seems to be the case if you believe the science people. That seems to be what they're saying. So, and if you're in the New Age and you kind of and you worship a woman, the divine feminine, that's not the divine feminine is not going to teach you how to be a man, right? And how to lead women. Like that's not what the divine feminine wants. So you have to find a God that demonstrates to you how to be a masculine man. Now, what does that mean? That's the big question. And this is why I became Christian and why I'm a very enthusiastic evangelical Christian now, because I think Jesus Christ is the highest example of how to be a man. And I think that bears out all through the New Testament over and over again, and is culminated in his self sacrifice on the cross, to say that the highest use of personal power, once you've acquired it, is in self sacrifice for the good of people around you, in a way that they can't do. I think that's the highest, is not to dominate over everyone, which he could have done. He was tempted by Satan, right? Those three temptations to have domination over everyone. And he said, no, I submit myself to the will of God and I sacrifice myself, because that's what's asked of me for the good of all. I think that is such a profoundly beautiful masculine image in climax. And throughout his ministry, you can see him being tender, you can see him being fierce, you can see him being frustrated, you can see him being tempted, you can see him being all the different aspects of a man, really, really fleshed out in a way that called people higher and didn't put them down, right? It put down the Pharisees, it put down the corrupt, right, over and over again, and it challenged all these authority structures, right? But it didn't walk around saying I'm alpha, for
Right.
example,
Yeah.
right? And quite the opposite. So I find the highest example of masculinity in Christ. Full stop.
Right. Right. And but again, to your point, it's having that connection to something bigger than yourself. And in your example, it's having that connection to God, because that orients your life in a and it's the other piece is, I think part of the problem is, as you alluded to earlier, there people are chasing different principles to use to orient their lives, and a lot of that
Mm.
creates anxiety because there's so much confusion. You don't know which one to pick. You pick one on one day and another one on another day,
Huh,
but
yeah.
having that one uniting principle gives you proper direction in life.
Yeah. And a man without a consciously cultivated spiritual life is missing some of the best parts, is missing meaning, right? Like why? Why am I here? Why are we here? What's the meaning of life and of my life? I mean, you can't get that from just looking at matter. You have to get that from spirit. You have to get that from looking at a higher story that seeks to answer these questions. And you have to get it in a way that animates you towards righteous living daily, to encounter the struggles of life over and over and over again and give your full self to them. If you don't have a theology that gives that to you, like, why go on fighting just because I choose to? Well, we're not Neo in the Matrix. That's a really cool line. Why do you keep fighting, Mr. Anderson? Because I choose to. It's like, yeah, cool. You're a movie character. Though most of us are not a movie character having a climactic battle in the Matrix, right? Most of us are dealing with the everyday mundanities of life. Changing diapers, right? Getting up at 5:30 in the morning so we get an hour to ourselves to read or work out, or petty bosses or whatever. Like, why to keep on going? Because God commands me to serve my people, to serve everyone around me in a spirit of love, and to continue working to bring forth His kingdom. That's why,
Right.
right? And the reward is in the work. And so
Absolutely.
as long as your theology supports you in that,
Yeah.
that's the most
100%.
important thing.
For sure, for sure. And to your point, otherwise you're also just chasing instant gratification, right? You're not holding yourself
Easily.
accountable. You're just like, oh yeah, I could just do this and do that, and there's no meaning. And I mean, I've lived that life, and
Yeah.
it was a blur. There's no purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. You can chase pleasure endlessly, right? You can watch all the movies on Netflix and look at all the porn and play all the video games and eat all the food and cool, enjoy that. And then you'll get to like 50 or 60 years old and you'll start wondering, what was it all for? It's like,
Right.
and if you ask the wrong people, they'll be like, nothing.
Yeah.
Well, that's not satisfying. I don't think there are a lot of people a lot of men who are at the end of their lives, the last months or days of their lives, and are like, yeah, it's all about nothing, bro. I don't think
Yeah.
the men say that.
Yeah, well, or they're afraid of the end, right? And you see that a lot
Yeah,
too. You see that a lot, and that's kind of been my biggest realization is when I see people at peace as they age, it's like, okay, they know what they were doing. They were living a life with purpose. Whereas
yeah.
the people that are afraid of aging, or they're constantly avoiding it, it's like, okay, there's something you're scared about.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps rightfully so. I mean, regrettably, but they're being forced with the questions as men, and women too, but since we're talking about men, they're being forced with the questions that they denied. And we started the conversation talking about what's wrong with men, right? And I mentioned that there's the two kinds of men broken in half. Now, there's a lot of virtue and a lot of value in being a strong and confident and directed man who's motivated to achieve in the world. Fantastic. But there is a point where that runs out.
Yep.
At some point, it's different for different men, right? Whether it be retirement, illness, some lack of capacity, very old age, when you can no longer, and every man will get there. And there's this lie. Okay, the wall is a real thing for women, like that, past the point where they can safely have children is essentially what that is, right? And when their bodies and their faces and their physiques begin to change, like mid-30s is roughly when that is. There's a wall for men too, right? As if men don't age, as if a man doesn't reach 65, 75, is way outside, but like, and start to experience himself not being able to compete with 20-year-olds. So you got a wall too, bro. And when you hit the wall, you're going to have to look at your life on the other side of that, and praise God if you live that long. What are you going to do then? Because your life, you're not going to have some different life. It's all the same life. Is everything that you're doing right now in your life leading up until that point in a way that when you cross that boundary, it will have been worth it? It will set you up to be a man at peace in your old age. Is what you're doing now feeding to that? Because it can. And I can tell you that when you get there, you'll probably be much happier to be at peace with your decisions then, right? Than
Yep.
you can evaluate right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's always thinking about what kind of relationship you have with your future self. And
Yes.
that's how
Well
I look
said.
at it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Um, Will, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on here. And I feel like we could keep talking, but we also have to end.
Easily.
Yeah, but I've learned so much too. So, I really, really appreciate that. I'm super grateful for people that want to get a hold of you, find you online or social media. What are some ways they can do that?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Ren of Men. You can find my podcast by going to Linktree/Ren of Men. And if you're interested in my 12-week men's mentorship, where I make a lot of these values and thoughts and ideas real in your life, you can go to renofmen.com/mentorship and read more and see testimonials there.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'll put all that in the show notes. And yeah, thanks again for doing this.
Thank you, Furkan. This has been great.